When one sews, one inevitably ends up with scraps and odd bits of fabric and whatnot. I love a good scrap project, but I don't want to make a quilt or a scrunchie or something. I want to make a pair of 17th century stays. Yes, let's make a pair of 17th century stays out of scraps.
Okay, so it's actually not that difficult to make something big out of little scraps. You just have to have a strategy. These lines are really important, these sort of vertical lines, so we don't want too much like patchwork going on to kind of muddy that. I know I want to use a lot of these lace scraps. They're obviously just tiny little scraps, so I'm going to need a base for them. And I've got a lot of strips of things. Most of it is like very lightweight cotton or linen because I do a lot of chemises. However, I have a lot of this bed sheet too, and I don't really know where that came from. Anyway, it's all very lightweight, so I think I'm going to have to like interface it. But then I think that that will make actually a really nice base for the lace. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. The stays are actually pretty simple in terms of construction. They're just an outer layer of watered silk and then an inner layer of linen and whalebone or baleen that's sandwiched in between. And then they're actually made of these 5 long panels. So, I think that that will work out with my strips pretty well. And of course, I've been referencing a lot of Vivienne Westwood for this project. She does a lot of these sort of corsety looks that are mostly 18th century, but she has definitely referenced the 17th century as well. Not that that really matters for this project. Her approach is very free. It's not that I really want to copy her. I just want to sort of, practice at that freedom, if that makes any sense. Her early punk shirts are they're so iconic. They really kind of set the tone for the entire punk movement. They're rough and beautiful and kind of pieced together, which is perfect for what I'm doing. Anyway, lots of really great stuff happening here. So yeah, let's get started.
To catch you all up, I've already scaled the pattern from POF 5 in Illustrator a couple of times and come to a rough scale that moderately fit me in paper form. And as luck would have it, moderately fit me in toile form as well. I then used that moderately okay fitting toile as a proportional stand-in so that I could make a skirt. There was a shoe video too, but I've decided that video is not canon. So like Tales of the Jedi, it's fun, but not necessary to understand the wider 17th century Vivienne Westwood universe. You can see the full toiling process in the skirt video. So without further ado, let's jump into the construction process. I began each panel by tracing the pattern onto the base fabric, which occasionally needed to be pieced. I arranged the lace on top with the rough cut edge of the lace featured within. I redrew the pattern onto the lace. I then basted the lace to the fabric along the outline of the pattern and very carefully sewed around each individual motif of the rough cut edge of the lace. I cut away the excess lace from the motifs of the rough cut edge, leaving behind the pattern of the lace. I repeated for each of the 10 panels of the body of the stays. I used cotton canvas, also left over from an earlier project, for the inner layer. I laid each panel self onto the canvas and basted around the pattern perimeter within the seam allowance. Let's talk boning for a minute. I usually use synthetic whalebone from Burnley and Trowbridge, but they were out when I was buying supplies for this project. Instead, I decided to try out an old costumer hack and used cable ties as my boning. This hack is so ubiquitous, I don't even know if it qualifies as a hack anymore, but honestly, I don't really understand it. These stays require up to 17-inch long boning in places, and the only cable ties I could source that were long enough were these huge things, which, spoiler alert, didn't work, but we'll get there in a minute. Anyway, I decided to use the bigger ties only for the places where they were absolutely necessary because they're also expensive, and smaller ties for the majority of the boning. I marked out my boning channels onto the self panels in friction pen. I sewed the boning channels on the machine without cutting the panels out of the fabric, because I didn't want the edges of the panels to fray with all the extra handling. As with the last corsety thing I made, I threaded the sewing tails from the front of the boning channels to the back, and tied them in a knot with their corresponding back tail to make sure these channels don't come loose at the ends.
I have never seen a seaming treatment that is quite like this before. The way that these seams are put together is that a piece of grosgrain ribbon is sewn to the edge of one side of the seam, and then the other side of the seam is sewn to the other side of the grosgrain ribbon, and then the back of the seam is whip stitched in both directions, and then it is pressed flat. I thought that I would have enough grosgrain ribbon to actually do this. However, after calculating the length of all of the seams plus the perimeter of the corset, because that needs to be bound in grosgrain ribbon as well, I do not. So I tried something else. Okay, so this is what I have always referred to as grosgrain ribbon. However, technically it's Petersham ribbon. So it's got this kind of ribbed construction here. It's got a scalloped edge. And if you pull it, you see it kind of like unwinds itself like this, which I find really satisfying. But anyway, this is technically true grosgrain. So it has the same ribbed construction. However, the edge is sealed, so it doesn't have that scalloped edge. Also, it does not unwind. This is widely available everywhere. However, it is very hard, it's unyielding, and it kind of just like springs back. Surprise, surprise, did not work out well for the seams for this. I mean, I don't know, I just feel like this is really important, like all of this line work going down here, that's kind of important to the overall look. It emphasizes the construction of the stays. I really like it. So I'm gonna try to kind of preserve that. However, this is not going to happen.
So I used twill tape, which does have just a bit of give. Twill tape is much thicker than grosgrain, so to avoid bulk, I laid it on top of the edge of the seam and edge stitched. I then matched the edge of the corresponding panel and edge stitched. This may seem like a weak seam, but it is actually quite strong so far. The shark fin shaped side panels get 3 hip gussets, 2 of which are inserted into slits and 1 into the seam between panels 2 and 3. Like the body seams, the gussets get some fancy grosgrain action, which, like the body seams, was not going to be possible for me. So I basted the gussets on top of their slits and sewed a ribbon on top of the seam. Fancy. I fell stitched a different cotton twill tape to the inside. If you think I'm juggling a lot of different fabrics and trims here, gird your loins, there are more to come. I then sewed the internal twill tape over the inside of the body seams. A lot of the success of this project was just in figuring out which seams and seam finishes came in which order. Speaking of which, most of the boning could be added from the top or bottom of the panels, but some was enclosed by the seams and needed to be added before finishing the seams. Something I realized after finishing the seams. Oops. The back panel gets a little pieced strap. And then I sewed the back panels together, connecting the body of the stays. I cut each piece of boning to precisely match the length and angle of its channel. And I used reed left over from an earlier 18th century stays project for the longer boning channels, but more on that in a minute. After placing the main boning, the back piece got a boning channel that spanned the entire length of the shoulders, something I did not account for when I measured out the longest piece of boning I'd need. Thank goodness for reeds. I bound the stays in Petersham ribbon. I did not have enough of one color for the entire perimeter, so I used light pink for the front and dark pink for the back of the stays. I sewed the Petersham ribbon to the edge, right sides together. I trimmed away all the rough bits and flipped the ribbon to the wrong side, encasing the raw edge, and fell-stitched it down. The stays also feature a stomacher, which is a loose, boned panel that slides behind the front lacing to cover the gap. I added a piece of twill tape to the top of the boning channels. A piece of reinforcing tape was added to the tops of all the panels of the extant stays, but I only did this for the stomacher. This was where I realized my big cable ties would not work at all. The edges are very squared, and it caused a weird stepping effect. Not cute. Instead, I used the before-mentioned reed boning. Reed is technically historically accurate for this sort of thing, and it comes in these long coils, so length isn't an issue. It does break though, so fair warning. I had to be very careful with which trim I used where. I have a limited supply of the Petersham ribbon, so I used the white twill tape as a binding on the side of the stomacher, which won't be seen. I then sewed light pink Petersham to the top of the stomacher edge, which will be seen, right sides together, and felled it to the back. The body of these stays are now more or less complete. However, these stays also have sleeves. I had some larger scraps of very bright pink lace, but not enough for 2 complete sleeves. These were 2-part sleeves, so the bottom of the sleeves were cut from this pink lace. And the tops were cut from, yep, there it is. Not that there's anything wrong with this tinselly applique, but no, not for this project. I removed all of the tinselly yarn from the face of the lace, which was thankfully only loosely basted on to begin with. Honestly, I don't know where I got this scrap from. I've never worked with this fabric before. Anyway, I cut the sleeve tops from the newly de-tinseled lace. I stitched the sleeves together on the machine and bound the raw seams with bias binding. I sewed 3 little tucks in the sleeve cap. Again conserving trim, I bound the raw edge of the undersleeve with beige twill tape, and the sleeve cap in the darker Petersham. The extant sleeves are cuffed, so I turned up the bottom 3 inches of the sleeve and basted it into place. I carefully snipped a strip of the motif from a scrap of the larger pink lace scrap. I placed the motif to cover the raw edge of the cuff. I applique stitched around the edge of the motif. To bring back some of that tinsel yarn, I couched a line where the reinforcing ribbon is in the original. I then wove another piece through the couched piece. If you're thinking this would have been easier done before putting the whole thing together, yes. Now to connect everything. The back, I'm sorry, I'm just going to call it a tail, is pierced with an awl so that a ribbon can be laced through to connect the back side skirt. That's the stay skirt, not the skirt skirt. I attached eglets to the ends of each ribbon once it had been laced. Ironically, eglets were used to ease lacing historically, while mine had to be done after lacing because they were too big for the lacing holes. The front of the stays got 23 sets of eyelets for the lacing. Each shoulder got 2 sets. The sleeve caps got 5 worked bars, as did the shoulder seams of the body of the stays. I used ribbons to attach the sleeves and shoulder strap, and a very, very long mini twill tape to lace the front of the stays. Okay, they're done. And just 6 short weeks behind schedule. There were a lot of breakdowns throughout the process, both emotional, mental, physical. I don't even care. This was the most complex project I've ever taken on, and it taught me a lot about myself and what I'm capable of. It was messy and at points ugly and even unsuccessful, but every time I do one of these historical designer mashups, I move my own design thinking forward, and that is always worth the effort. I always appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to see where the design fancy takes me next, hit subscribe. My upload schedule is out the window these days, but there's some fun stuff coming up soon. Bye!